So welcome everybody. Tonight's talk was actually designed for people who don't come to the Shambhala Center or have just started to come or don't really know why it's called Shambhala or what that means. So, and I know some of you know this very well. So you're going to have to be nice and patient while I explain first principles, basically. Because that was what the purpose of this talk originally was when we planned it. We thought, well, we're about to launch into this series of 5 weekends over a period of probably 12 months altogether. And we should give some indication of what these weekends are about and how they relate to our core mission as a Buddhist meditation center. So we were originally called the London. What we were originally called the London Dharma Group, and then we grew a bit and we became known as the London Dharma Dhatu, which is a Buddhist term drawn from the Vajrayana teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. And the reason we got that name was that because our center, along with many others throughout the world, was founded by a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, whose name is difficult to memorize, and who has written many books. And we in Britain started to know him through his books, and then started a group to follow his teachings. And it grew into first the larger center called Dharmadhatu, which took place in Clapham, where it still does. And then at some point, we were renamed the London Shambhala Center. So I need to say a little bit more about the term Shambhala, which also comes from Tibet, although it's not specifically a Buddhist term. We were from the very beginning a Buddhist teaching center, and when I started, everything we taught was Buddhist. And it was just later that we started to hear about and then teach the Shambhala teachings, which were being propagated by Chögyam Trungpa, drawing on his own background from Tibet. So he had been trained in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery to be a teacher. He was recognized at a very early age as the incarnation of a previous great teacher, a bit analogous to what happened to the Dalai Lama, plucked from a nomadic village high in the mountains of Tibet and brought down to the monastery. Luckily, he was allowed to have his mother with him, and then trained to become a meditation master and a Buddhist teacher, which he became. And so his background was deeply imbued with the Buddhist teachings, which he studied for about, I would say, 20 years as a student. Nearly 20 years. So our center started out by running courses and classes and weekends and longer events based on that Buddhist tradition that he taught. And we still do that, actually. We still have such courses. But around the mid-70s, we introduced a new element. And that comes from the fact that the Chögyam Trungpa came to the West in the late 60s. Well, he came to Britain in 1963, moved to Scotland and founded a monastery there you may have heard of called Samye Ling, which is still going strong. and then moved to America in 1970 and started to teach the very fascinated American students, mainly hippies actually, who were fascinated by the idea of a real live Tibetan Lama that hadn't been seen in the West before. So they got into that, and he taught them the Buddhist teachings for a while. And after about 5 years, he thought, this isn't necessarily what everybody wants over here. Specifically, he found a lot of his students were not so much into religion. They were sort of breaking away from their traditional religion, and they were more interested in the path of meditation and the path of enlightenment, of gaining some kind of spiritual awakening, rather than religion as such. And at that time, there were a lot of teachers beginning to move into this more secular style of teaching, you could say, teaching wisdom rather than teaching religion, which is an important distinction. So Chögyam Trungpa drew on something that was very deep in the culture of Tibet, parallel to the Buddhist culture of Tibet. And that was a mixture of an earlier religious tradition that was more shamanic in origin, known as the Bön tradition, and also a folk culture that also had very ancient shamanic roots, and which harked back to an earlier era of Tibetan history, which was part of a culture that didn't really have a name, but extended through Central Asia, and especially up to the borders of China, and included Tibet. And that was very much imbued in the everyday life of Tibetans, but was distinct from their much more kind of precise and academic Buddhist culture and training. And he drew on that, together with the fact that everything he taught was, as I said, deeply imbued with the spirit of Buddhism, and started to put together a new way of expressing the core essence of the wisdom that the Buddha had created 2,500 years before, and which is now treated, if not exactly accurately, but is treated as one of the great world religions. Although a lot of people say it's not strictly a religion because it has no concept of God, but nevertheless, it has a lot of, especially the Tibetan Buddhism, has a lot of religious iconography and a religious seeming iconography and a terminology and ritual and paraphernalia. And so Chögyam Trungpa wanted to get away from that. And so he started to reinvent the language. He became very fluent in English. And he felt it was time to reinvent the language such that there was no need to use the Sanskrit and Tibetan terminology that Tibetan Buddhism was, well, all Buddhism uses Sanskrit terminology, and we all know words like karma and dharma. But also there were a lot of Tibetan terms as well, less familiar perhaps to most Buddhists, but very familiar to those following the Tibetan Buddhist path. And that requires people to learn those terminologies, and also reminds them that they're entering into a different religious tradition. And so he felt that he'd like to start another way of presenting the wisdom of the Buddha and the path of meditation, the path towards enlightenment or full human realization, free of all that from the past. And he called it Shambhala. They called it the Shambhala Teachings. Now, Shambhala draws on one of the strands of Tibetan culture, which is a myth. We'd call it a myth, a legend, that somewhere in the high Himalayas, hard to find, in fact, impossible to find unless you're a very highly enlightened or realized person, there is a mystical kingdom of Shambhala, whose king had gone to see the Buddha when the Buddha was alive in India, and had received very profound teachings from the Buddha that he took back to his kingdom, the kingdom of Shambhala, and where he had taught it so thoroughly and so widely and so broadly that their whole society became an enlightened society and entered another dimension, according to Tibetans, which is why it's so hard to find, unless you yourself are highly enlightened. So that's the legend. And he liked that legend because part of the reason that the Buddha taught the specific teachings to the king of Shambhala was that they were teaching specifically for lay people. The king of Shambhala said, I see that all your students are monks and nuns, they're all monastics. And that's how the Buddha taught. He taught a path for monastics, for people who were ready to renounce the worldly life, to take to the streets with begging bowls, to basically look for a much simpler, purer way of life that didn't involve conventional norms at all. And the king of Shambhala said that's very well for them, and that's great, and it's marvelous. But I'm the king of a country, and I want my people all to learn your wisdom, but I don't want them all to become monastics, or the country's economy will crash to the ground. So he asked specifically for teachings for lay people, and that's what he took back to Shambhala, and that's why the whole country was able to become an enlightened society. So that was the legend that Chögyam Trungpa particularly liked. And when he realized that the Buddhism of Tibet was under threat because of extinction, actually, because of being taken over by Chinese communist forces, he thought it's going to be very important for Buddhism in the future to have a context that is able to withstand the aggression of the modern world. And so he wanted to create a path that was not aimed at monastics and people retreating from the world, and therefore being quite defenseless against aggressive forces, but rather to address what he found in the West, which was the people who wanted a spiritual path, but they also wanted to have jobs and families. They wanted to live a conventional or semi-conventional life, a modern Western lifestyle. And so that's why he created this alternative formulation, which he called the Shambhala Teachings. And he retained the practice of meditation, which is really at the core of Buddhism. It's how the Buddha started. Before he started teaching, he gained his enlightenment through practicing meditation, very simple meditation. And that meditation is universal to Buddhism everywhere. And so that core element is retained in Shambhala. And the meditation equally is seen as the path that carries us along towards ever greater spiritual realization and enlightenment. And then he reinterpreted the core teachings of the Buddha in modern English terminology. And so he replaced many of the Sanskrit and Tibetan terms with familiar English language, such as, let me just look at I wrote down some of the most obvious cases, such as warriorship in the non-aggressive sense, as being a noble warrior, such as is found in many cultures of the world, where the warrior is a noble figure. He used goodness instead of bodhicitta. He used courage, confidence, fearlessness, gentleness, all these as the core values of Shambhala. And therefore, he was able to teach in this way and bring the essence of the Buddha's wisdom in a new language. English language, obviously, because that's what he had learnt and mastered and what his audience was familiar with. But it's a new language for teaching the Buddha's spiritual truths. And the purpose of doing this was to create a path that could be combined with family life, with having a job, with all the usual lifestyle of a Westerner, and that would make sense and connect with the benefits of everyday life, create benefit for people living in everyday life. So that was the motivation. And amongst many teachings that he gave, he put together a series of 5 weekend courses. We call them levels. Sometimes we give them numbers, levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so he tried to put the essential teachings of transmitting the practice and the technicalities of learning to meditate into those 5 weekends, and also the essence of his Shambhala teachings, to be a kind of introductory package that would bring the meaning and understanding of Shambhala, make it very accessible. And from there, we in what is now the Shambhala Center continue to teach more advanced programs in that tradition, in this Shambhala tradition, and more weekend courses, longer courses, retreats, and to create a full spiritual path which has many parallels and equivalences with the Buddhist path, but and can be practiced alongside it. So many of us at the Shambhala Center have studied and practiced the Buddhist path. In my own case, that was my starting point, and I did only that for about 5 years. And then in parallel and continuing, also study the Shambhala path. But it's perfectly possible to choose just one and study and practice just the Buddhist teachings or just the Shambhala teachings. So they are parallel, they are distinct, they are different, but the essential spirit behind them is very much the same. And the more we become familiar with both bodies of teachings, we realize that they're actually putting across the same wisdom in different forms, just as we will find the same if we go into the more profound aspects of the Vedic tradition, the Vedanta tradition of India, now known as Hinduism, or if we go into Taoism of China, or if we go into Sufism of the Middle East, we will find the same core wisdom expressed in very different language and very different forms. So the forms are different, but the essence is the same. One of the aspects that's different in Shambhala is Chögyam Trungpa saw that it was very important to embed these Shambhala teachings in our modern Western society, and he felt it was really crucial that we engage with the idea of society as not as a problem to get away from, as might be seen in a monastic context, but as the source of our life and our livelihood and our social life, and something to be celebrated and, where possible, improved on. So there is a social aspect to the Shambhala teachings, and that's expressed in the vision that Shambhala is not only a path for cultivating our individual wisdom and understanding in order to benefit us as individuals, but is also a path to cultivate our understanding of how to relate to our society, how we can help our society, and how we can help build a kinder, more compassionate and wiser society. So that is the long-term vision of Shambhala, often encapsulated in the phrase to help create an enlightened society, which is a very big and ambitious vision, and which obviously is going to take a very long time. But it's part of what distinguishes Shambhala, is that it has this social vision. So I think I've put across as well as I can the essence of what Shambhala teachings are and how they relate to Buddhism. But you may have many more specific questions about this, and I thought this is a very good opportunity, if you have questions, to ask about this, about the different aspects of what we've been talking about.